Thanks everybody for joining us today. So this is the Rank and File Network's series of discussions around organising and learning lessons from across the trade union movement in what's been a really difficult year for most of us, if not all of us. You know, the opportunity to organise and for the trade union movement to still play its crucial role, you know, I think that's been hampered somewhat. And so what we want to do is we want to learn lessons from across the movement about how we can build a rank and file trade union movement, not just within PCS, but across the board, because I think it's workers that really need to lead the way during these incredibly scary and difficult times. So we're joined today by two comrades from the RMT. So we're joined by Daniel Randall and Andy Littlechild, and they're going to speak to us. We will have an opportunity for questions and things. And yeah, so I will hand over to you, Daniel, to kick us off.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for the invite, comrades. It's good to be making these kinds of connections. So, as was mentioned, my name's Daniel Randall. I'm a station worker on London Underground and an RMT rep, and also a member of the socialist group Workers' Liberty. So in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about kind of issues within the union, and then Andy, I think, is going to speak with more of a focus on kind of workplace and industrial organising. And in a sense, that's kind of the wrong way around, because as we all know, a kind of consistent rank and file perspective starts from the workplace and aims to concentrate its fire on the bosses and catch the bureaucracy in the crossfire if it gets in the way, as the old slogan goes. But that's the order we've decided on, so I hope you'll indulge us. I don't know how closely, if at all, people on this call have been following the kind of conflict inside the RMT that has broken out into the open somewhat recently, and which has led to the recent announcement of the retirement of our General Secretary, Mick Cash. There's been quite a lot of bitter interpersonal allegations thrown around, including allegations of bullying and harassment. And it goes without saying, I hope, that democratic debate and criticism and dissent have to be completely separated from personal bullying and abuse. I also want to say that I bear Mick Cash absolutely no ill will whatsoever on a personal level. I wish him well in his retirement, and particularly in confronting some mental health issues that he's faced recently and has been admirably open about, which I know must have taken no small amount of courage. Our union's National Executive Committee has agreed an external investigation into bullying in the union, which I support and I hope is conducted rigorously. So I just wanted to kind of say some of that by way of introduction. I don't want to focus too much in this talk on the kind of internecine micro detail, and certainly not the interpersonal detail of the conflict in the RMT. So I'm going to talk in fairly general terms about what I think are some of the issues behind it, and give my views on what the opportunities and challenges facing a rank and file perspective in the RMT are. So our union has a reputation as one of the more militant unions in what we might call the mainstream labour movement. And I think that reputation is largely deserved. We do have a relatively more militant culture than most other unions, and I think it's fair to say that there are relatively fewer barriers in terms of the kind of internal structures and culture of the union placed in the path of groups of RMT members who want to take action. That's not to say there aren't any barriers, there certainly are, but I think, as I say, there are relatively fewer than in some other unions. I think the RMT is also, in terms of our constitution and formal structures, relatively more democratic than many other unions. So we have 4 elected national officers. It's the General Secretary, 2 Assistant General Secretaries, and a Shipping Secretary. All our regional officials, regional organisers, are directly elected. There is a central bureaucracy of unelected staff, but it's relatively slight, and certainly much slighter than in a union like Unison or in the PCS. And partially that's because we're much smaller, but I think it's also in part because there's quite a strong lay culture inside the union. So in constitutional terms, the leadership of our union between AGMs is the National Executive Committee, and our NEC is a full-time executive but made up of rank and file delegates. So they're people who are kind of seconded from their job for a fixed term of 3 years. Consecutive terms are prohibited. So when an NEC member finishes their term, they have to go back to the shop floor. The NEC is chaired by a full-time national president. That's also a lay position without consecutive terms. And our constitution, our rule book, makes very, very clear that the NEC is the kind of day-to-day leadership of the union. And the role of national officers like the General Secretary is effectively to kind of carry out the instructions of the NEC. And I think the roots of the kind of present conflict in the union mainly lie on this terrain, the question of who runs the union, which has been posed quite explicitly in a lot of the sort of internal debate inside the union. So is it the General Secretary supported by other officers and union staff, or is it the NEC? I'm oversimplifying there quite dramatically, but that's the sort of broad thrust of what's lain behind some of the current debates. This conflict reached a bit of a crescendo recently when the General Secretary straightforwardly refused to carry out an instruction from the NEC to circulate a resolution that it had passed, which is in sort of direct contravention of his very sort of explicit constitutional role. I mentioned a few minutes ago that all of the RMT's regional organisers are elected, which sets us apart from some other unions where equivalent positions are appointed. But once elected, those officials, unlike our lay NEC or our lay national president, they become permanent union staff. So if you get elected as a regional organiser, you quit your job and you enter the employ of the union. And that obviously creates a kind of structural pressure, which for me is really the essence of what the bureaucracy is as a kind of social element. It's that layer within the labour movement that sees the movement in fundamentally institutional terms, as its finances, its office functions, its buildings, and indeed their own jobs, rather than seeing unions in a sort of instrumental sense as instruments or weapons, if you like, of class combat. And I think there's a core of regional officers inside our union, along with some of the union's unelected staff, who've acted as a kind of Praetorian guard for the General Secretary since his election in 2014, and particularly since his re-election last year. As I said, I don't want to go into too much detail on that. Andy, who served the term on the NEC from 2017 to 2019, might have more to say on that, because he witnessed some of that culture kind of at first hand and up close. The term member-led union gets bandied about quite a lot in the labour movement, in our union and in many others. And quite often I think that term is sort of superficial jargon that should be replaced, in my view, by the much clearer and more direct term democratic. But a lot of debate in the RMT is focused on the meaning of this term. What does it mean for a union to be member-led? And supporters of the General Secretary have said to some of his critics, you say you want a member-led union, but the members have elected the General Secretary twice, and you've obstructed him from kind of going about his business. And I think that's a very staid and static notion of what democracy is, in which the rank and file membership is a kind of passive element which elects officials to do things for us. And this kind of thinking was also evident in Mick Cash, our General Secretary's statement to members announcing his retirement, which kind of directly suggested this sort of bureaucratic service provision based conception of trade unionism. So the statement said, "From now until my successor is elected, the membership must have the confidence that we are fully behind them and will continue with the exceptional level of service that only we provide." So the model of trade unionism that's suggested here is one in which the union, as an institution run by officers and staff, is external to the membership, such that the union, can be fully behind them, the members, providing them with a exceptional level of service, as the statement said. And you can see this same thinking expressed in union statements to members about industrial action. So frequently, in the context of industrial action, RMT members will be called on to support their union, rather than conceiving of industrial action as the kind of self-activity that workers are undertaking to directly advance our own interests. So we can see from this that even within RMT, with our relatively more militant culture and relatively more democratic constitution, this kind of bureaucratic service provision model of trade unionism is still prevalent. And I think that culture does permeate down quite deeply, and consequently there can be a gap between the RMT's self-presentation as a militant fighting union and how the union actually organises on the ground. And I think there's a fundamental lesson here, which I'm sure will be very familiar to activists in the PCS, that having your leadership simply declare that the union is a fighting union or a militant union doesn't actually make it so. Genuine militancy is something that has to be built and constantly renewed. And whilst it can and should be encouraged by a leadership from above, if you like, it's fundamentally something that has to be rooted in the union's culture on the shop floor. The missing element here for me is an independently organised rank and file network that can act as a counterweight to the power of bureaucracy. Part of what's prevented such a network from emerging, in my view, is a kind of RMT patriotism, which is quite deeply entrenched even on parts of the union's left. And it's a kind of view that would almost have you believe that the conflict between bureaucracy and rank and file has somehow been resolved or doesn't exist inside RMT. Comrades might be familiar with the old axiom about a certain type of sort of ultra loyal Labourism that says socialism is whatever a Labour government does. And there's a version of this same thinking advanced in some quarters of RMT along the lines of fighting militant trade unionism is whatever the RMT leadership does. And even on the left of the union, there's a tendency to present shortcomings as a matter of having the wrong individuals in leadership positions rather than anything deeper in a structural or cultural sense. So within the union, both myself and Andy are involved in something called the Campaign for a Fighting Democratic Union, the CFDU. There have been several organisations with that name previously in RMT history, and the latest iteration is still very embryonic and quite amorphous and contains within it lots of different conceptions as to what its role is and what its purpose should be. But it does hopefully represent a space for union activists to think through some of the issues that we're discussing here today. And I'm hopeful that, cautiously hopeful, but hopeful that a more worked out rank and filist perspective might emerge from discussions within it. I'll start to move towards a conclusion now, and I just want to address a couple of problems of what you might call political culture that I think also are part of the picture here, and that a rank and file network in our union would need to overcome. Comrades will probably know that there's quite a strong Stalinist tradition in our union. So supporters of the Communist Party of Britain and the Morning Star are still quite prominent within the union officialdom. And you can see that influence of that tradition, particularly in a number of the union's international policies, especially around Europe. I'm not going to go into the detail of that here, but linked to that political tradition is what we might call a kind of cultural attitude that has, I think, quite an essentialized view of what it means to be working class. And that can contribute in some sections of the union to a certain sluggishness and conservatism around organising outsourced migrant workers, for example, and a preference for focusing on what are euphemistically referred to as core grades. So directly employed workers in sections of the workforce that tend to be whiter and more male. Now, that's not uniform by any means, and there are activists in the union from the CP tradition who have a much better approach and have done good and impressive work in this area. And also that conservative attitude is by no means limited to Stalinists, but I think that is an issue that I wanted to kind of bring to the discussion. Somewhat linked to that is a certain conservatism around liberation and equality politics, which sees the self-organisation of what we might call oppressed groups, so women, LGBT plus people, disabled members, and so on, sees that self-organisation as somehow disruptive or divisive to workers' unity. So an independent rank and file network in RMT, I would argue, would need to take up these sort of questions of political culture. And there's a direct link to questions of democratic structure here as well, because a particular fault line in the union in recent years has been around the question of how much power and autonomy our self-organised equality committees should have within the union. There are other democratic reforms I think a rank and file network in our union should fight for, like a workers' wage for union officials, for example, which I know is a live discussion in PCS2. And there'll hopefully be a rule change going to next year's AGM, which would mandate our NEC to recognise a rank and file dispute committee comprised of workplace reps in any industrial dispute, which would ensure discussion about the directions of disputes would take place as close to the shop floor as possible. I think an RMT rank and file network would also fight for a more consistently industrial unionist strategy than our union currently does, both in terms of empowering all grades of workers within our own union, directly employed and outsourced, but also seeking joint action with other transport unions. Now, there are significant barriers to that, not least the fact that the other two main transport unions, TSSA and ASLEF, are highly sectional or craftist, even in the case of ASLEF, and much more industrially conservative than RMT. But I think that industrial unionist approach needs to be pursued nonetheless, and the kind of bureaucratic service provision approach that I've talked about necessarily sort of cuts against that. So just in conclusion then, I think there are quite a lot of lessons in this sort of general picture, but the fundamental one, and the one I want to kind of reiterate in conclusion, is that having a relatively more militant culture historically, or a relatively more democratic constitution, or a kind of generally left-wing style, does not resolve the structural tension between rank and file and bureaucracy. And to radically transform our unions, or even just to tip the scales of that imbalance of power towards the rank and file, we need independent rank and file organisation. So that's it for me. Thanks again for the invite. Thanks for listening. I'll hand over to Andy.
Thanks, Daniel. That was really interesting. Certainly gives us a lot of stuff to think about. We will, by the way, be asking people to come in with contributions and questions after Andy's spoken. So, and we'll be using the kind of hands system on Zoom for that. But yeah, I'd like to introduce Andy. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thanks to the network for inviting me and Daniel and me to speak. Obviously, it's quite sort of like an issue we're going through at the moment. But to be honest, these issues have existed in the RMT for a very long time, and they're not confined to Mick Cash. There's always been a bit of a patronage culture in the union that's operated in many ways, with the purpose of subverting all of the things that Daniel talked about the democratic structure and the ethos of the RMT, to give control to the officers who are elected to serve the members, but who often feel that because they're there for 5 years at a time and they could be re-elected, that it's them that run the union and not the NEC, and they know better. And so this has gone on for a long time. Something Daniel mentioned. I mean, I'm just gonna finish on what Daniel was talking about before I move on to talk about workplace organising. But one of the things that Daniel talked about was the regional organisers, and as a rough kind of way of describing it, we've got regional organisers and sort of like in 3/3. There's a third who are really good at their job and got support from the membership in their regions and their reps and branches, who do a good job and pretty much can be re-elected every 5 years when their term comes up and not be put out of a job, because they're good at what they do and they're actually rank and file minded officers. And about a third of them, they don't get into wars with the General Secretary and the other senior officers. They kind of just get on with their job. They give them a certain amount of respect that they're due, but they're not kind of under their control. They're independent, and they know that their membership will re-elect them because they're good at what they do. There's another third who are also really good at their job and probably don't have any fears about not being re-elected and losing their job after their 5-year term. And they've got a bit more of a combative attitude towards the General Secretary when he kind of gets up to his antics. They won't go along with what he says, and they actually choose to take him on from time to time more than the other third, who basically just get on with their job and keep out of any sort of internal strife. But the problem comes with the last third, who a third of the regional organisers, I'd say, just roughly speaking, are actually shocking at their job. And if it comes to an election without support under the table from Unity House in all sorts of underhanded ways, would not be re-elected by the members. And it's this third are the problem third, and the ones who basically are linked to the bureaucracy in a real major way and do the bidding of the General Secretary and the other people in Unity House. And they're the ones who kind of we have a lot of problems with. But this patronage culture is a control mechanism that's been used for a long time to thwart, and to keep things under the control of the bureaucracy. And it's something that has only really come to a lot of people's awareness recently, because Mick Cash chose to put out an email to all members accusing the NEC of bullying him. So most of the time, reps and activists who know about all this stuff going on, we don't bother the members with it because we deal with it ourselves, through the structure we've got in the union and try and counter it. But we don't bother the members with it because it's kind of pretty ugly stuff and it's not a delight to talk about. So we just get on with our job, and, unless we have to, we kind of just deal with it because it's not a pretty picture. But with Mick Cash writing to all members a couple of times now, accusing the NEC and others of bullying him, and even more recently, even the whole of the AGM that took place online a few weeks ago, they have now been accused of taking part in this bullying, and that's resulted in him retiring. But this is a historical issue. Now, what we traditionally do is we fight through our branches, through our regions, through the various committees, grades committees and equalities committees. These are all things that we can use. And as Dan said, we've been trying for some time to reinvigorate a rank and file movement called the Campaign for Fighting Democratic Union. And with some success in terms of it's brought together most of the sort of rank and file kind of minded people, activists and reps and officers in the union are kind of loosely associated around the idea of the CFDU. But it needs a lot more work to make it function in a way that can really take on these issues in the union. But fundamentally, you know, these kind of problems that you get in unions are not generally the issue that members worry about. They don't like to see that this stuff is going on. What members are worrying about is their day-to-day kind of life at work and the issues they face with management, and often which stem from the government. But building a rank and file network is also useful for fighting for the democracy of the union as well. So hopefully we can enlarge the CFDU in terms of supporting the better people who are carrying out functions on behalf of the membership. But also, and Dan also touched on this, the importance of building rank and file organisation on the shop floor to take care of workplace issues. Excuse me there. Right, so that's more what I want to talk about, sort of moving on from where Daniel is. It's the other aspect, you know, and it's actually probably the more important aspect in some ways of workplace organising. In a rank and file kind of way. Obviously, there's different sorts of workplaces, and for people who are thinking about getting involved in workplace organising, there is a series of questions that are really important and considerations that you need to have based on your workplace. You know, what type of workplace is it? Is it spread out geographically, or is it centralised where you've got everyone together? What is the workforce like where you work? Is it a unionized workforce? Is it partially unionized? Or is it very, very likely or not unionized at all? Is it all staff who work for the parent company, or is there maybe agency and contract workers in there who are less likely to be unionized and more kind of like at the mercy of their employers? Or, you know, is there self-employed people? And all these things basically will determine how you need to approach organising in your workplace. And, you know, if you are yourself in a non-unionised workplace, and can you engage with your workmates openly, or do you have to do it covertly? And these are real considerations that need to be considered, because at the end of the day, it's not going to do anyone any good if you get yourself sacked or other people sacked trying to organise your workplace. So in terms of this, if we sort of I'll just touch on a couple of bits and pieces here that occurred to me and I'm aware of. You know, if you are in a non-unionised workplace that's hostile to trade unions, pretty much, if you are determined to organise it, you're going to have to do it covertly. And the way of doing that has been tried and tested by lots of trade unionists and workplace activists in the past. Generally speaking, you know, you need to work out in your workplace who is trustworthy, because this has got to be covert. You know, you can't necessarily stick your head up above the parapet. So mapping out your workplace in terms of who will come on side, who is debatable whether they're going to be trustworthy or not, and who is basically a stooge of management. You need to kind of work out who you can begin to build with. And when you do that, it's probably going to involve things like getting the people that you trust away from the workplace to have meetings out of the workplace, you know, somewhere that's nearby that everyone can get to before work or after work. So you can have a meeting to discuss, you know, whether there is a will to organize, you know. And I'd imagine if you're in a non-unionized workplace where there's this kind of culture of anti-unionism, there's also going to be pretty bad work conditions going on as well. So therefore a need to actually fight these things and get a grip on it and promote the interests of the workforce. So there's lots of things to consider, you know. If you get to the point where you've got people around you, we'll build in that with anonymous leaflets to other people in the workforce. And when you're ready to tackle issues, you know, there's ways you can do it too, like anonymous contact with management, where you put demands to management in anonymous letters. And there's even ways of taking anonymous action, like if you can organize it so that people will take an action together without there being someone who's necessarily seen as being leading it. So there is ways of doing that. Now, that's just a very brief overview. I haven't got time to go into it here, but I know the IWW do a lot of work, and they've got a training course called Workplace Organizer Training that touches on a lot of this stuff. And personally, recently, back in the summer, I was assisting some workers who are working in the Brompton Bikes factory in a workplace where there is a union, United there, but they don't organise, and they're kind of like redundant. The reps aren't able to act as reps there because for whatever reason they're not any good. And workers there in Brompton Bikes organised in this covert fashion for quite a while, and then at some point when they had a bit of strength, they were able to come out and elect delegates to have meetings with management to sort out some pretty drastic health and safety measures, issues they had in their workplace there over in Greenford. So that's, in a non-unionized workplace where you're a bit vulnerable, that type of covert organizing is probably how you're going to have to do it. If you're able to organize openly, as a rep or as a member of the union, as an activist, it's obviously going to be a lot easier, especially if you're an activist who wants to organize and you've got a rep in a workplace who might not be an organizer, might not want to organize on a rank and file kind of way. They just might want to do the sort of basic job of a union rep and plod along. But if you've got a mind to start organizing through the union in your workplace and you've got a good rep, well, that's going to make things easier because they'll probably be quite happy for you to take on that role and even to sort of lend you their facilities to help get it done if you're not actually the rep yourself. If you are in a unionized workplace and you're unfortunate to have a really bad or corrupt workplace rep, and it does happen, as we know, then I think really you're in a position where you're going to have to organize the workforce that are being neglected by the rep in a covert manner as if you're in a non-unionized workplace. So that's just some of the really difficult scenarios that you may get yourself into. And in that scenario where you've got a bad rep, it is possible that you should maybe think about challenging the rep when it comes to the election in the branch, if your AGM or whatever, to stand as a rep yourself. So that's because a lot of people will find themselves in those scenarios. I just wanted to briefly cover them. I mean, it's not personally the situation I've ever been in. I've been in a bit of a mixed situation where we've had a lot of staff who are unionized and together, but with agency staff working alongside us as well. So we've had to do a bit of both, where we could organize openly as RMT members employed directly by London Underground, but where we had to be a bit more sensitive in the way we organize the agency workers, because their company would potentially kind of like wheedle them out over a period of time if they found out they were getting involved in a union. So my experience has been to kind of have to do a bit of both. Now, there are some common things and some common goals in terms of workplace organising that we're going for here, things that are really important, and there's common means also to get into them, and that what you're trying to do fundamentally is to lift up the workforce so they feel confident, so they feel emboldened, and you lift up their chins and so they can win and fight disputes with management, especially in your own workplace, because that's where you've got to start. Obviously, if there's issues across the company, if you work in a bigger company, then you need to bring your members along with that, because that's how the union works. But we're talking here about organising in your particular workplace where you work. And there's certain things like people need to see that everything can be fought for. There is no issue that you should not take on and let management get away with. Everything you can, you should fight against management on and try and get results and victories. And some of those things are going to be individual grievances or problems. Some of them, you won't be able to tell the other workmates about, because they could be quite personal, and they could be particular to that person in such a way that you can't broadcast either what the issue is, or maybe not even if you win the issue and get a resolution, because it might be of a personal nature. But apart from those very kind of personal issues, even individual grievances where you can, where it's appropriate, you know, it's really good to collectivize them, you know, so that people know that someone's having trouble and that there's a fight to get their issues sorted out, whatever it may be. And collectivizing issues at work is what needs to happen, you know, because this is how we build workplace coherence amongst the workforce. And there are obviously a lot of issues that are immediately collective anyway. So those issues you need to keep them collectivized, i.e. not take them on board as a rep if you're a rep, and just deal with management with them. Now, there's lots of ways of doing this. You know, the ACAS guidelines that are there, and you kind of can quote them, they give trade union reps such things as the ability to consult members before meetings with management, and also after a meeting with management, the ability to report back. Now, I know that not a lot of reps use that facility for whatever reason, because of time, pressure, this, that, and the other. But if you're really looking to build a workplace organization, this facility time to consult members before meetings and to report back afterwards is invaluable, and really, I'd really strongly suggest that you make really good use of it. And at my depot in Lily Bridge in West Kensington, that has been one of the major tools that we've used to build the workforce up and to bond them together and to make sure they have control of what the reps are doing and of issues that we're taking forwards and so on and so forth. So, and it's really important, we found that when we hold meetings in the canteen, that we advertise them well in advance. We try and get everyone to attend the meeting, and we always start off the meeting by saying, right, sisters, brothers, this is your meeting. This is where you get to say what you think, ask the questions that you want, hear what the issues are, what we're doing about them, and tell us whether you agree with what we're doing or whether you think we should be doing something different. So what we try and do is positively make the meetings the property of the workforce, and that the reps are there basically to report back and take instruction from the workforce in the meeting. And we labour that point all of the time to keep that going, and it's worked. So we have quite vibrant meetings with, you know, and people are pretty disciplined. Sometimes we're talking about, you know, 100 odd kind of people, you know, sometimes more, sometimes less, but there's a lot of input from the floor, and people feel free to give their views, even when their view may be contrary to the general feeling in the room. You know, and we also try to not squash people down who might have concerns and want to raise, you know, they don't think we should be doing this or doing that, because at the end of the day, we want people to have the freedom to express themselves properly and everything else. And we've used this to great effect. And as I'm underlining there, you know, having these meetings in the workplace, if you can. I mean, obviously I said that different workplaces, different, some are spread out, and you might have to kind of like adjust how you do that if your workplace, your members are spread out all over the place. But that's just something you've got to find out a way of doing. Another thing that we do, and is very, very helpful to building rank and file organizing, is to have a class perspective on things and not to be scared of putting that forward, because the fact is, you know, most working people get it, you know, and if you kind of like talk about things fundamentally as they are, you know, with the bosses having all of the power in the workplace traditionally, you know, and but it's us that does the work, you know, and without us, they're useless. And if we stick together, you know, they may have the ability to intimidate and try and bully us, but if we stick together, they can't bully all of us. And through doing that, you know, the confidence does lift up, and you know, you get to the point where people feel that you know, their power, and especially when you get into disputes that you've collectivized in this manner, because then you can have victories. Because if you bond everyone together like this in the workplace through these kind of steps, you then are more likely to have a victory when you get into a dispute. And there's a theory that's been talked about that describes where you want to try and head things. It's called a virtuous circle, which is the opposite, obviously, of a vicious circle. And the idea is, and it's true because I've seen it, is if you can have a fairly small victory, then what happens is people's confidence builds. You know, they might not have been expected to get someone's disciplinary sanction kind of downgraded, or to get a health and safety issue sorted out. You know, in the early days, they might not have expected to win that. And they might have kind of half believed you when you said, yeah, we can do it. But when you actually win it, all of a sudden, the confidence lifts up a bit more. And then you can go for a slightly bigger kind of issue that you need to take on in the workplace. And let's face it, all of us can sit down and write out a long list of things that's wrong in the workplace. It's not hard to find these issues. So when you win a slightly bigger one, then the confidence rises more, and so on and so forth, as is what is described as a virtuous circle, where you build and build and build, and you can take on bigger issues and win a fair number of those kind of issues that you have with management. And leaflets are important, you know, in the workplace. They don't have to be kind of with pretty pictures on and beautifully set out. Very simple leaflets, and lots of them, you know, putting them out on your own back, not waiting for the national union or your region or your branch to produce them, but do your own leaflets. You know, at work, you can knock them up, and when the manager's not around, use a photocopier, print up however many you need to do, and dish them out, because it's important that people see the union in the workplace, and they see the local union, the workers together in a workplace functioning together, and their issues actually in print, put out all over the tables or wherever you can put it on the notice boards, especially when you have a victory, you know, celebrate it and put it out there. So what I've found is through doing these things is we've managed to build workplace organization to quite an effective degree. I think there are things that are common to all workplaces, bearing in mind that all workplaces may be different and you have to adjust this sort of thing. But fundamentally, building a culture of worker strength, disdain for management, confidence, and bonding everyone together, you know, is what you're aiming for in workplace organizing, to take on the bosses. And also, you know, in terms of what goes on in the union further up, because those things have to be dealt with, you know, the members will then be on side when you may need to take on elements of the union that are acting outside of the workers' interests and the members' interests. There's other things in terms of workplace organizing. I mean, there might be disputes that you get into that, for one reason or another, they may be something that you need to enact immediately. So you might not be able to go through all of the usual sort of steps that the law demands in terms of putting action on. Or you might be raising an issue that is in some way kind of really contentious. And if you get into a dispute situation, you might need to, even in a unionized workplace, act covertly. And so through identifying people that you can trust and, you know, getting them to talk to their workmates, you can kind of organize, you know, strike committees and action committees and committees for doing various sorts of things well. And we've made some use of doing that. So I think fundamentally, if you've got the need, which most people have in their workplace, because most people are facing lots of issues, and you've got the desire to do this, I think there's clear steps you can take which will enable you to build this workplace organization and a fighting spirit in your workplace. So just my reflections and thoughts on some of my experiences, and thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks ever so much for that, Andy, and thanks again, Daniel. That's some really interesting stuff there about, you know, organising in a rank and file way, and how workers need to take control not only of the workplace but also of their union as well. So we are going to open up for some questions. If you want to ask some questions, please use the raise your hand function. The session is being recorded, so you feel free to, when you're speaking, to not be on camera, or to let us know that you don't want your face appearing in a YouTube video or anything in due course, because then our master editor can edit your face out. And yeah, so I will open the floor to any questions. or contributions? Don't raise your hands at once, mind. Oh, Phil, I can see you waving at me.
Yeah, cheers. I think I just wanted to kind of touch on the point that Andy was making about doing things covertly and then also using the tools available to you in terms of things like facility time. I think it'd probably be useful. I know this won't necessarily apply in every workplace. I'm talking obviously as a member of PCS and HMRC, but one of the things I've particularly noticed is that even with things that give us rights and give us the power to talk to members, like facility time, there is often a way for employers to kind of institutionalize that in a way that can work against us in terms of something more rank and file controlled. Particularly, so the difference that I'm noting between the RMT and PCS is that PCS don't have NEC members seconded for the 3-year period, and they don't have term limits. So when we're elected to the National Executive Committee, we're lay reps, so we still have to do that within facility time, and then still have to do the day job. But there's no limit to how long we can be there, and the same applies for other committees. So I suppose one of the things that jumps out about that is that if your time off the job, particularly those who are on 100% or close, and even with the restrictions imposed recently by the law, there are still people who do that. If your time is given by the employer, that puts you sort of a lot more beholden to their kind of interests. And even reps who think of themselves probably quite sincerely as left-wing and left-leaning, that kind of thing pulls them towards this sort of view of kind of going in contrary to, I can imagine sweats breaking out and everything Andy said about, publicising, collectivising individual issues or things like that, and saying, no, we have to respect the confidentiality, you have to go through the steps, escalation processes and all this sort of stuff. And so you can see how it's easy to be pulled into the kind of institutional, individualised version of trade unionism, where it's all about, representing on a sort of, you elect me to do my job, I'll go off and do things for you, and you just sort of trust. I think kind of leading back to what Daniel said. So I suppose what would be interesting from their perspective is to hear how they think, what the best way to guard against that kind of institutionalization of the rights that we have under the law, like the best way that they'd approach that.
Shall I come in on that?
Yeah, please.
Steve, yeah. Glad you asked that question. It's a really good question, and I'm keen to speak to it from a highly personalized perspective, because I'm just coming to the end of a 3-year term as a full-time 100% facility time rep, right? So within the sort of collective bargaining machinery we've got on London Underground, there are a number of rep positions which have they're elected positions that they have 100% facility time. Again, within RMT, we've got a no consecutive terms rule on those positions. So I've done my term now, and my term's finished. I can't restand. I've got to go back to the shop floor. But so I've got this very immediate 3 years of experience of being in that kind of position, and the pressures that Phil talks about are absolutely there, because you end up in, particularly in a period of a relatively low ebb of struggle, when there aren't workplace battles kind of popping up all over the place, there aren't big strikes, things like that. Inevitably, a lot of what you do, unless unless you work very hard to kind of apply some counter pressure, a lot of what you will end up being either individual casework, which has certain, which applies kind of certain pressures, or it's meetings with management that take place, pre-pandemic, obviously, take place usually in some nice, pleasant, air-conditioned office. You're away from the workplace. You're out of, I'm out of uniform. I'm not working shifts. And it's very easy to start thinking of your role and indeed the functioning of the union as kind of taking place on that terrain, that it takes place that the endeavour of trade unionism consists of you as a very important senior full-time 100% facility time rep going into those meetings with management and having those discussions, and that's what trade unionism consists of. And again, the workplace membership, the rank and file membership, is reduced to a kind of passive stage army there, and this reproduces itself really acutely when we kind of get into, I think anyway, when we get into negotiations around industrial disputes, and you'll hear reps talking in terms of like, you know, we need to deliver a ballot mandate so the negotiators have got a kind of bargaining chip to go into the negotiations with, as if the negotiations, like, that's the terrain of battle, and the role of the members is just to kind of be this stage army for the negotiators and the full-time reps to sort of wheel on and off, rather than seeing the workplace as the terrain and members' own self-activity and self-organisation as the thing you're focused on. So I think all the kind of pressures and risks Phil identifies are real. Just to finish on a couple of things I think we can do to counter that. Well, on a personal level, I've endeavoured to work some shifts every now and again. I mean, that sounds like a small thing. I haven't done it as much as I would have liked to, or probably should have done, to be honest. But I think that's important, that members, you know, don't get the impression that people get elected to these full-time roles and then just disappear for 3 years. So I've tried to kind of retain a bit of a connection to the workplace in that sense. I mean, this is potentially controversial. I'm not sure this is something I would push within the union, but I think 100% facility time positions are at best a very double-edged sword. And in fact, I'd probably go as far as to say, if I was kind of redesigning our collective bargaining machinery from scratch in a kind of ideal way from our point of view, I'm not sure I'd have any 100% facility time positions within it. Because actually I think you want your senior reps, I don't really like that term, but you know, your kind of leading reps, you want them to retain a connection to the workplace, and having someone on 100% facility time, unless they consciously choose not to use all that facility time and to do a few shifts every now and again, breaks that connection inevitably. So I think that's definitely something to think about. I mean, it is tricky given the sort of attacks on facility time. It's a big bugbear of the Tory members on the Greater London Assembly. They're always going on about how much money TfL is spending on, you know, paying for people on facility time, and I can well imagine they will kind of come for it at some point. So I wouldn't particularly want to be advancing these arguments for a reduction in facility time in the context of an attack on it by Tories. But I think from our own point of view, from a rank and file point of view, it is, as I say, at best, a double-edged sword.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, it's very true that to be honest, I think getting rid of full-time positions would be a good thing. I think it does do exactly that, and I'm aware that that Daniel, you know, as he said, has you know, he said would like to do more, but I'm aware he has gone back to work on the odd shift and that to keep him with his work colleagues while he's been on full-time release. But I think the vast majority of reps that get full-time release don't actually do that, and you enter into kind of like a rarefied world of meetings with management and everything. And I think facility time really does engender that kind of you know, like Daniel said, like a passive workforce who just you know, just like a lump, like a mass, and it's the reps that do the important work in the meetings with management and everything as well. You know, I think I was putting forward what I was saying in terms of it being a workplace rep. That's the kind of where I was coming from with what I suggest in terms of organising the workplace. And it's even a danger there, you know, that can happen. As a local rep, you can get into that position and be seen like that by the membership in the workplace. And one of the things we found useful to counter that, and it's quite particular to us because we work on a track in like quite a dangerous kind of an engineering environment where there's lots of hazards, and a management basically who sometimes have very little regard for people's health and safety and expose you to all sorts of contamination from asbestos and chemicals and biological hazards, you know, and power tools, and you know, we're lifting rails up in the air on jacks. I mean, and like we're lumping around heavy stuff. So it's been quite easy for us because the members have been presented on many occasions with really dangerous situations, and something that we've kind of, that we've instilled the confidence to do, and the members have got the confidence to do, and that is to refuse to work on the grounds of health and safety. So we have had a culture in our workplace of, downing of tools, spontaneous downing of tools, in the light of this kind of pressure from management to work unsafely. And, it's been really helpful for us in a way. I mean, it's not helpful that you're exposed to these dangers, but as a consequence, people have learned to fight. And that's been something that's kind of really added into our combative spirit. And, we've had people really badly injured, and we've had people killed on the track in the past, people that we knew. So it's kind of up the ante, and it kind of pushes people into taking spontaneous kind of workplace action, without even a rep there sometimes, obviously they generally do like to do it if you're kind of working with them that night. They feel a bit more confident, but it is, the issue of the rep kind of doing everything is always ever present, even when you're not on full-time release and you go out and work on a track like I'm currently doing now and other reps are. But when you've got full-time release, it really does make that issue. In terms of using the facility time to report back to members, generally how I do it is after a meeting, I just send an email to management and I say, following a meeting on Wednesday, this Wednesday come in at 11 o'clock, because that's when we book on. I'll be reporting back to staff on the meeting outcome in the usual manner. I like using that phrase, in the usual manner, because it kind of like it settles it, so they can't really say no, right? So, and then we just have it in the canteen. Generally, management don't come in the canteen when we're doing it, and sometimes we get lower level managers who are usually union members, and actually quite good because they come off the track and they're kind of on side. But all of these things are difficult to do. But you just have to find ways of doing it and combating, these kind of detrimental things, that the dynamics that occur within the union. You just got to find ways to combat it and to keep trying to bring the power back down to the workforce. And it's just an ongoing thing. You have to be at all of the time. It's just something you've got to do and get on with and do what you can to keep the the workforce running things and involved and confident.
Thanks for that, both. That was really interesting. One of the things that, because in the absence of other hands up at present, one of the interesting things I think, and it would be interesting to hear your take on it. And I know, Daniel, you've got a dash at one, so I'll come to you on it first. But if there are negotiations
interrupting, but I put my hand up about 15 minutes ago.
Oh, did you? Oh, yeah. So sorry, I didn't see it on my screen there, Janine.
Chris Marks has got his hand up as well. It's there in the participants.
Oh, it's not showing up on my screen there. Sorry about that. Oh, I'll come to Janine then.
Yeah, and apologies, I've got to leave at about the same time that Daniel has. So I also work on London Underground. I'm also active in the RMT, and I also used to be on the council that that Daniel is about to stop being on. One of my earliest memories of being involved in the RMT, so I've been a member for nearly 24 years now, is of a regional council meeting and this shows how long ago it was, in the old Unity House that was on Euston Road. And it was in the middle of the fight against a public-private partnership on the Underground. And so there's lots of people at this regional council meeting, including lots of full-time reps. And there was a discussion about, management had said they'd threatened to take away their full-time release if we carried on being bolshy, okay? And really impassioned discussion at this meeting about what the union was going to do to defend full-time release, etc. And when we finished that discussion, we moved on to the next item, which was how we were going to fight the privatisation of London Underground. And half the people in the room left and went outside for a fag. And that image has never left me. It speaks to me very strongly about the fetishization of and obsession with full-time release and keeping your own comforts as a rep, that people prioritise it even above their entire job, the entire job being sold off. So that's always, that image always comes into my mind when I think about full-time release. Now, interestingly enough, the council that Daniel's on, again, I'm showing my age again here, it didn't used to be full-time release. Certainly within living memory, it wasn't full-time release. And as it has become full-time release, that has been matched with a reduction in the recognition of ordinary workplace reps and the amount of release they get. So what's happened has been a shift from the empowerment of workplace reps to the release of a higher level of reps. And that is a really bad thing. So I think I would push the abolition of full-time release on London Underground, but say the abolition of full-time release combined with the recognition of more workplace reps with release. So then the total amount of release stays the same, but it's shared out more evenly amongst reps at different levels. Just a kind of note in the margin about full-time release as well, actually, is that it discriminates against part-time workers, makes it practically impossible to become a representative at that level if you're expected to work full-time. The other final thing I wanted to mention, and it relates a bit to what Daniel and Andy have both said, is about RMT having this reputation as a fighting democratic union. And partly it gets this reputation because most other unions are much worse. So it's kind of a negative thing rather than necessarily a positive thing. But I actually think in RMT specifically, part of it arises from a confusion of militancy with machismo and from a confusion of competence with confidence. So people in our union like to be fans of strong, confident leaders who clench their fists and shout a lot, even if they then go and sign a rubbish deal with management. Because that's what fighting unionism looks like. Actually, militancy is about how effectively you fight the boss, not about how loud you shout and how much you thump the table. I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that, Janine. And I've just seen a whole bunch of hands fly up now. I've been made a co-host of the meeting, so sorry about that. If I come to you, Chris, as well.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, just to touch on this question around secondment and 100% release. I think Dan sort of covered it. I mean, the question of, I mean, I don't think seconded NEC members is conducive to rank and fileism. You know, Dan and we talk about it a lot in the union, this bubble that's created with the negotiators and the people on full-time release and the employer inside the bubble and the members outside of it. And, you know, we've argued against 100% facility time in PCS for a long time, even before the government stepped in and forced everyone to be on 50%. You know, I don't think that the state should arbitrate on how trade unionists spend their time, but clearly people on 100% are by very nature disconnected from the workforce. I mean, I remember hearing a story at our conference of a rep in the Northwest. I think some people on the call will know who it is. I'm not going to name names, but who boasted that they'd only worked for the employer for 2 years out of 30 years of service. So they'd been on 100% facility time for 28 years and been promoted twice, by the way, in situ. So I think there's a principle there. I think the difficulty though for us in PCS, and I'd be interested to understand how the RMT comrades deal with this situation. When we have outsourced workers or facility management workers who we don't have a facility time or collective bargaining agreement with, who cannot have facility time, then how do we resolve that particular issue of representation? Because perversely, those reps not having the ability to take any facility time could in fact take power away from the workplace by forcing full-time officers to take up those organising and representing roles. And actually that's what happens in PCS at the moment, and really a question for us in terms of the organisational review that the union's undergoing at the moment is how we can fix that, because there is an issue there, and how unions deal and make facility, I guess, for reps in non-organised, non-recognised workplaces, giving them the same sort of rank and file control that we do, because we have fairly generous facility agreements. Just very quickly, I mentioned the review that the PCS has ongoing, which I think gives us the opportunity to discuss the sort of structural changes that Dan was talking about at the beginning. And obviously we'll do that in the spirit of attempting to shift as much power structurally away from the centre and from the bureaucracy in the union. I mean, as Andy was saying, we also have some pretty dire full-timers as well, who would soon be out of a job if they were elected, which is, again, something that we have consistently pushed for and will do as part of this structural review. But I don't think in PCS, and again, Dan and Andy talked about the difference between the structural issues and the cultural issues. I think in PCS, the key question really is cultural. I mean, we've had a decade of over a decade now, nearly 20 years of a so-called left leadership, shifting the responsibility for things like negotiations, organising, recruitment, etc., from the workplace to the centre, which has in turn obviously disenfranchised and demoralised the membership and sapped exactly the sort of confidence to win that Andy was rightfully saying that we should prioritise as the key to building power in the workplace. So perversely, in PCS, when the right wing controlled the union and the left was forced to engage at the workplace, the rank and file was much stronger, and the workplaces were arguably much better organised. And as a symptom of that positive organising in workplaces, Mark Sawatka was elected, a lay rep. He wasn't on the NEC beforehand. Decades and decades of full-timers having that general secretary position, was elected to the position of general secretary through rank and file, through a rank and file upsurge. And like I say, since then, the left have centralised power and control. And as Dan and others have said, that the leadership has simply just declared that PCS is now a fighting militant union. But we can't deliver strike ballots. Organisation is weak, and we can't even maintain density rates, even when the employer is recruiting more than it's ever done before. So I guess my question to the RMT comrades is, how have you been able to stave off that kind of inertia? If you have, and it seems from what comrades are saying, although I've noted Janine's comment just now, how have you managed to stave that off? And how have you managed to maintain the ability to back up some of the so-called machismo, as Janine said, with action? Because it seems like there still is that industrial strength on the ground, which doesn't exist in PCS. And so I know I'm going on for a bit. I just have one sort of final question. We believe that organising things like the rank and file is important, but we also, obviously, me and Phil and others on the call stand for internal positions. What is, Dan and Andy, what is, how do you approach those elections in the union? For example, the general secretary election and that's ongoing, I understand. And is it purely propagandistic? And so if you could comment on how you'd approach those sort of things. I understand you back candidates, but would you stand yourselves, for example, even if it's purely sort of propagandistic, based on the sort of rank and file politics that you've been outlining today? Thanks.
So what I might do is, if I ask you to come back on those points, if you've got time to, and because I know you needed to leave at about 1, and then I'll come to you, Georgina, and then if that's all right with you, Andy, I'll come to you after Georgina's asked her question. Fab. Thanks, folks.
Cheers. Yeah, I've actually got the time of my next call wrong. It's actually at 1:30, so I'll probably stay for a little bit longer. So yeah, I'll try and respond to Chris's questions. Apologies if I miss any out. So on the question he asked about outsourced workers working for employers where we might not have recognition agreements and therefore they don't have a rep structure and facility time and some of the challenges that creates. I mean, on that's a problem for sure. I mean, one approach and one way we've tried to respond to that is where we've been able to, reps that we've elected kind of within the union for those groups of workers and those employers, although they're not recognised by their employer, we will get those reps to just ask for unpaid leave from their employer, and then their branch will subsidise their loss of earnings. So there's the kind of the union is providing facility time, if you like, rather than it being done officially through a recognition agreement with an employer. That's not perfect, and obviously, you know, we've been trying to push for recognition agreements, proper collective bargaining structures within those outsourced employers, as well, obviously, as a kind of overall political push for direct employment and in-housing. But that's definitely a challenge, and that's one way we've approached it, by the union subsidising loss of earnings. Chris asked about how whether we have, and if we have, how we have kind of retained workplace strength and you know, backed up the machismo with genuine militancy. I mean, it varies. I think a lot of Andy's, you know, Andy has been a exemplar of good shop floor practice in his particular depot, and you know, where we've got a good and effective rep or group of reps in a particular workplace, they've been able to maintain organisation and strength on a kind of shop floor level. I think some of the other factors behind kind of where we're at organisationally are kind of objective things about the nature of the work we do. So working in the transport industry, you know, we've got more industrial leverage than other workers, you know, and London Underground workers go on strike, the transport system stops moving and London kind of grinds to a halt. So the fact that we've kind of got this degree of industrial leverage in some ways makes it easier to retain and build up and kind of inculcate that that consciousness amongst workers. But I have to say that it's not, you know, it's by no means all rosy for us. The last time we had a network-wide ballot of London Underground station staff, which is the bit of the Underground I work on, was a number of years ago. It was relatively soon after the new laws had come in, and we missed the threshold by a long way. The last combine-wide all grades industrial action ballot we had on London Underground was kind of underway during the start of the first lockdown and kind of got pulled. So we actually don't know what the outcome of that would have been. But we have, you know, we've had more than one experience of missing the threshold in ballots. So it's not the case that kind of everything's perfect and we're absolutely firing on all cylinders all the time. I mean, in some prominent disputes in our union elsewhere than the Underground, for example, a dispute on mainline railways over keeping the guard on the train and trying to fight off driver-only operation, we have pretty consistently managed to return repeated ballot results there. And I think that's partially a function of having, you know, there are some drawbacks and limitations and so on to those campaigns as well. But I think that was partially a function of having a kind of big, high-profile kind of campaign around that industrial issue that kind of built up its own momentum. So those are some of the answers I'd give to that. And then finally, on the question of internal elections, I mean, look, speaking personally, you know, as Chris knows, I have no objection in principle to, you know, I think there's a sort of vulgar rank and fileism that believes that, you know, if you stand for any position higher than that of a workplace rep, you will automatically become kind of corrupted and bought off. Clearly, I don't think that's the case. You know, I think it's good for candidates with a rank and file perspective to stand in internal elections in order to advance that perspective. I think there's a strategic assessment to be made about how useful that is in a kind of given moment, but for sure, I mean, standing in internal elections is one of the means via which a sort of rank and file perspective can be advanced. And I know, you know, Andy and Janine have both served on the national executive, so I think would probably agree with that. So I'll leave it there. And I don't know, Steve, I don't know whether you're going to go to another question or if you wanted Andy to come in now.
Yeah, I was going to briefly go to Georgina, who's been waiting patiently for us, and then I'll come to you, Andy, if that's okay. So, Georgina.
Hi, I just wanted to talk
You're on mute again, Georgina.
So sorry, I don't know what's going on. You know, this phone's terrible today. I wanted to talk about consultation and the structure that it holds in ours. I'm from PCS, by the way. So the structure that's held in ours, like you were talking before, and I'm completely in agreement with rank and file. It should be the membership that they should know from the moment that the employer comes out to you to the moment that you close on anything. They should be completely involved. Now, that doesn't seem to happen. Our biggest negotiations seem to go on behind closed doors, and you don't hear anything. Just as a lay rep, health and safety rep, whatever you hold, you don't hear anything until they've made an agreement. So the membership don't know anything. The membership don't get anything told to them until they come out and say, well, this is what's on the table. And for me, working it in that way, it's all too late at the end of the day. When it's got that far, it should be coming out at the beginning. So my question to you, I suppose, would be, how's the best way to put an end to that? Because, you know, to be fair, I'm a member, I'm a rep, we're all members. I think that sometimes, you know, it's forgotten that you're not running the union, the union's running you. And I think the membership should have far more say in what's going on and what's being discussed behind closed doors. And that doesn't seem to be happening. And I think it's a shame. And for what you pay, I'd like to know what's going on behind closed doors, to be fair. I like to have a say in that. And as a member, not even a rep, just as a member, I don't think that I do.
Definitely. And just to build on that, one of the things in terms of negotiations taking place behind closed doors is it does become very suspicious when the negotiators and the employer come out in joint sessions trying to recruit people to the union. It's very, very suspicious I am of things like that. So yeah, if I bring in Andy and then any other contributions that want to be made. You're on mute, Andy.
Yeah. No, we've had this problem in the RMT. I should imagine that all unions have this problem. The worst case scenario is in one dispute up in Liverpool, where the regional organiser was induced by the company Merseyrail to sign a document agreeing to have talks where they would keep the nature of the talks in the room and that they were not allowed to report back to the members on the progress of the talks. And that went on for a year. That's in recent time, that's the worst scenario we've had. You know, it's pretty shocking. On London Underground, where, you know, Janine and Dan and myself work, it's been a problem. And we've had to argue at meetings that before decisions are made, that a mass meeting is called. You know, I think all of us on this call for the RMT have been part of that process and putting that argument successively. I mean, sometimes we win the argument and we get it kind of accepted that before any final decision is made, you know, that's what we're talking about here, that there is a mass meeting where members are consulted before anything is signed off with management, you know, on big matters of dispute. And we've won that argument and we've had that practice instituted, and then all of a sudden it stops happening again, and then we have to win the argument again. It's like an ongoing thing that we've had to do lots of times. And in terms of addressing it, I think it's just a battle that you've got to keep on having, demanding that, you know, especially before something is signed off, that there's a mass members meeting. And that periodically throughout negotiations that there are at least reps meetings, you know, and sometimes even a members meeting periodically through negotiations, but definitely before anything is signed off. And in terms of doing that and how you achieve that, I think it's, you know, as someone in the PCS, a member and a rep, would be to talk about that with your workmates. You know, and point out to them that this should be happening, and then, you know, put some pressure on your reps, on other reps, you know, especially those who are involved in any sort of talks, to do that. And if that doesn't gain traction, then obviously maybe a resolution for your branch to that effect, that should happen. Or any time that you are actually in a meeting with the reps, you know, that are in these talks, demand it from the floor in that meeting. So I think it's just our experience has been we've had to use all of those means over the years to keep members and reps updated on the progress of talks. It's like an ongoing thing, and undoubtedly, Georgina, we're going to have to do it again. You know, at the moment we've got the practice kind of instituted from where we last left off, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen in the RMT in the London Transport region, which is a fairly good region in terms of the RMT. So it's an ongoing battle. There's a tendency for reps that are in these talks to sort of slip into it and not feel the need to report back maybe when they should do. And it's a tendency that I think you've just got to combat, like I said, by talking about it and building the conscience up with your members that it should be happening, with other reps, challenging the reps that are in the talks that aren't reporting back, and down to potentially maybe having to put in resolutions demanding it through your union structures. So I think fundamentally it's just an ongoing battle that you have to keep winning over and over again.
If I could just to add a couple of sentences to that, which, yeah, excellent question, Georgina. I think Andy's covered most of what I would want to say, but just to give two concrete examples on this, one from history and one slightly more recent. I think the kind of like the zenith, the high point of you know, how to conduct negotiations in a transparent, democratic and accountable way is during the Solidarność uprising in Poland in 1980-81, where the negotiations between the union leaders and the state bureaucrats were broadcast live over the workplace tannoy system to the occupied Gdansk shipyard. So all the workers could hear what their union officials were saying to the bosses. They could hear what the bosses were saying back, and they could hold their union leaders to account. It's a very kind of inspiring example. But more recently, in America, there's quite a widespread culture of contract bargaining, which, you know, negotiations over pay and conditions happening in sort of open meetings, basically. So in the higher education sector, for example, in the States, you know, contract bargaining between university management and unions will take place in you know, sort of in assembly, and union members can go and listen in. And, you know, not everyone is sat around the table. It's elected officials that are actually sat around the table conducting the discussion, but it's happening sort of in the open. So union members can hear what's being said. They can ensure that the union officials are kind of sticking to the agreed demands, etc., etc. And that's a culture that really doesn't exist very much in the British labour movement. There's an orthodoxy that, you know, negotiations are a sort of technocratic specialism that have to happen behind closed doors because it's a very complicated process that only the senior reps and the managers understand. And yeah, you know, maybe the reps should come out and report back to the members what's going on. But the idea that the actual process itself could be kind of opened up to mass democratic scrutiny is not, you know, is a bit of an anathema, really. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be that way. So I'm not suggesting that, you know, I'm probably not going to advocate immediately that our next set of negotiations on London Underground take place in that format, although, you know, who knows. But I think that's the kind of spirit and the model that we should be aspiring to, you know, maximum participation, maximum democratic scrutiny of rank and file members.
Thank you for that. Just even you know, we're not saying that we should be involved in the meetings, and I get the fact that, you know, there are going to be things that are discussed in there that you know, membership aren't always going to get to hear. But just give us a set of minutes, give us some brief minutes, some bullet points, something. Give your membership something just to say what's being discussed, because you know what, you could even, you know, that's not to say that people aren't doing some fantastic stuff behind the scenes. You know, there could be something in there that's really impressive that membership are like, God, you know, it's well worth my fees. But, you know, from a PCS side, our membership's dwindling away. And honestly, all I hear from members on the ground at grassroots is, oh, we never get to hear, do we, till the end? Oh, we won't be involved, will we? Or well, that'll be a sellout. And it's horrible, it's embarrassing. But yeah, thank you for that. Thank you to both of you for that.
Definitely. I'll bring in Phil, and then I think it'll be time for us to wrap up because we're heading close to our finishing time now. So Phil.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I suppose, a couple of points in relation to that. I think two things really. One is, I think Georgina sort of touched on it there, but this whole thing, when the discussions about whether or not these things should be confidential behind closed doors come up, one of the things that always kind of the defenders of that say, oh, well, I trust the negotiators. And I think the point to make in that sort of thing is that it doesn't matter. I mean, they could be the most trustworthy people in the world, and they could genuinely have those things on the side, and they don't have to be, you know, the kind of person who's inclined towards sellout for there to be a need to keep them accountable. Because if you're behind closed doors, it's not just the negotiators who can't be held accountable, it's management as well. And, you know, they will put different pressures on those reps to toe a certain line. We talked before about the pressures you'll feel as a rep anyway if you're in certain positions and certain things afforded to you. So that there'll be doubly so if you've got the privilege of being part of these negotiations and part of these talks with management, you know, because they need to see you as a reliable partner in the negotiation. So it's not just about whether or not you trust the negotiators. I think that's almost doesn't matter. It's about not making sure that, you know, the negotiator is negotiating in partnership with management to reach a deal to sell to members, or shouldn't be. It's about that being the voice of the membership, knowing what, you know, putting forward our demands collectively, and us knowing and being able to exert pressure as well, because obviously if they come back with something unacceptable, the fact that we then kick off about it is what sways that, rather than, you know, the fact that, you know, it's not sort of about having a silver tongue or whatever else. So I think that's important. I think as well, this is going to go, like, at least this is going to go on for, I think, you know, as long as that culture exists, as long as TUC affiliated unions in the form that they are now exist. So we're going to have to keep making that argument over and over again. But I think it is absolutely crucial that we, you know, make that argument. And I think most importantly is that we make that argument to the membership, because a lot of members will be of the view that, you know, they don't know any better because this is how things have always been done. And that phrase is the phrase that kind of instills conservatism. This is the way things have always been done. And if, you know, your union's actively not going out and, you know, hiding from you the fact that there are different views on this, you know, you're not necessarily going to know that. So we, you know, part of the job of winning that over is to make sure members know it doesn't have to be like this. Things can be done differently and more effectively. And I think that's just kind of the point I wanted to make in relation to that.
Thanks for that, Phil. You know, I think as a collective of workers, you know, we have no power unless we assert that power upon both our union and our employer, because things do need to change quite categorically. You know, when only 10% of people, of PCS members, vote in our union's NEC elections, for example, you know, that means that 90% didn't vote for those on the NEC. And so where is the voice of workers if we're not going to improve that voice? And we haven't improved that voice over the last few years, there is going to be no change. So this is where we need a rank and file movement to really assert that kind of collective power. And without that collective power, we will have nothing. So I don't know if there were any final thoughts from our two guest speakers before we wrap up today at all. Dan, Andy, anything from you?
Just to, I think I've covered what I would want to say, just to say thanks again for having us, and hope we can kind of continue the discussion.
Yeah, I've just got one further reflection on the issue of consultation, and that is there are people that realise actually having to report back to the members gives them a lot of power when they meet with management, because they can say, you know, I've got to report back to my members on this, and there's no way, right, that they are going to accept what you are proposing right now. And the better negotiators that we've got, they know that one, they should report back to the members, because that's how things should be done, so that the members can suggest other ideas as well. You know, because the thing we're overlooking is when you report back to workers, you know, workers can come up with things you haven't thought of as a negotiator that actually can progress the dispute and help you to win in the negotiations. And also, you know, better negotiators know that they can say to management, like I said, I've got to take this back to a mass meeting on Thursday. You know, there's no way I'm going to get this past them. They're not going to have it. So it actually, for those that are better, and we've got some of them, they make use of consultation with the membership in this fashion in negotiations to push things forwards. And that's so it's because, you know, as Georgina said, people get isolated in negotiation, and it's not a good thing. And you really, as a negotiator, you need your membership in the room as much as you can have them, even if it is that the awareness that you've got to go back to the members and explain to them what you've been talking about. You know, in that sense, they kind of can be in the room with you, and they can temper the way you behave as a negotiator. It's just an upbeat thought, really, on the positive aspects of having to report back to members for the negotiators. Yes, so just something that comes to mind there. Yeah, but thanks very much for inviting us. I've enjoyed the session. It's been very good to hear a lot of questions and points from other people as well. You know, because you always hear different things, so it's been helpful for me too. So thanks very much.
Cheers, comrades. I'm going to have to get off, but thanks again.
Thanks, Dan. So yeah, big thanks to Dan and to Andy for joining us today, and for everybody for giving up an hour and a half of your Saturday. But I think, you know, these sessions are really, really useful and really, really important for building a rank and file movement that can really, you know, wield collective strength in the end. So massive thanks to all of you, and a massive thanks to Phil for doing all the background work on setting this up today. So yes, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Keep an eye out on the PCS Rank and File Network Facebook page for the YouTube video eventually and stuff like that, and we'll make sure that's shared far and wide. But yeah, thanks for coming today, folks, and take care. All the best.